Just thinking. Okay. All right. Hello, friends. I'm a biologist and an atheist, not a historian or theologian. So one question I've heard many times before, though, is about the historicity of Jesus. Was he a real person, an individual, or was he a composite of many Jewish rabbis, or was he a complete confabulation assembled to serve as a tool for proselytizing by later religious leaders? This is basically a question about the ontology of Jesus, or more generally about how historians deal with and categorize named individuals from the past. How does one assess people and events that are contradictory, vague, or preserved only in stories passed on by word of mouth? And I don't know. I'm a biologist, remember. I have no clue. I've done a little light reading in history, but I'm not an expert by any means. So to help me out, Eddie Marcus offered to explain to me how historians determine what it means to say a named figure was a real person or a genuine historical figure. So just as I would trust a professional astronomer to explain why Pluto is only a dwarf planet and not a full planet, I thought it would be lovely to have a professional historian explain what it means to say that Jesus was real. Now, I hasten to note, neither of us think Jesus was a god or even a man with magic powers. So the question is really about what it takes to trust something from the historical record. So with that, Eddie, how about if you introduce yourself and then teach us all something?
Well, I'm not sure about the teaching side, but I'm perfectly happy to have a chat based on my experience. I should stress, before anyone gets the delusion that I'm an expert on first century Palestine, I'm not. My expertise is on Australian culture and history.
It's okay. I think we want a general picture. How do you approach this kind of problem?
How do you approach it? Well, we could take it from a number of ways, but I actually think there's a lot of commonality between the way science approaches evidence and the way history approaches evidence. There's also one, I think, very strong commonality. So we could get there slowly, but if we start right in the deep end and ask, what evidence is there about the resurrection? That's a pretty, throwing ourselves straight into the deep end. And I give the surprising answer before I go on. We have loads of evidence about the resurrection. It's what you do with the evidence that becomes the interesting part of where it becomes history. So we have 4 Gospels. The 4 Gospels are, for most purposes, considered to be amazing. They're 2,000-year-old texts, which are written comparatively close to the events they say they're describing. They're reasonably reliably transmitted through the last 2,000 years, so we can know that the Greek texts we have now are, give or take, very similar to what the first audience, at least by the time the text became fixed, which is about the year 100 or so. Most historians of the ancient world would love to have information like that, biographies, with named individuals about a person. This is evidence, and this is what I think a lot of atheists, when it comes to dealing with the Bible, don't realize, is that the Bible is wonderful evidence for something. And what it mostly is, of course, is very strong evidence for what that particular faith community who had that piece produced, their beliefs. So in the case of, say, the wonderful Gospel of Luke, and I like Luke best as a teller of stories out of the 4, we know exactly why he wrote it because he tells us in the introduction. He tells it, you, and thus presumably him, Theophilus, lover of God, God lover, you're doing these things, these rituals, you're believing these things, but we seem to have forgotten why we believe these things. So here are the stories, the origin myths, as it were, to confirm that we are doing the right thing when we drink the blood and eat the body. We are doing the right thing when we recite the Lord's Prayer. So in terms of evidence, the Gospel of Luke is amazing evidence for a community, a faith community, who had a set of beliefs and rituals somewhere around 85 to 95 AD. And that is, most ancient world historians would kill for that kind of evidence. And so treating it as an ancient Near East text, you're already starting from an amazing resource that I say, I wish I had it for most of the stuff I study.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. But again, the question is, was Jesus a real person or a composite or a legend? And yeah, you can say, okay, well, we've got good evidence that about 95 AD, there was a community of people who sincerely believed in his reality. But the question is, was he real?
Okay, this is where I'm going to probably alienate about half of your listeners by giving you the formal academic answer to what it means to be a historical personage. And I'd like to do it through a parallel with your own discipline, science. If you ask a scientist whether or not a theory is true, the theory of evolution, the theory of special relativity, any of these, if you really push them, they'll tell you it's not true in any meaningful sense. What it is our best explanation for the evidence that we have gathered. But deep down, every scientist knows bloody well that all those things are true. If I were to push you philosophically, you'd go, well, the theory of evolution is just a theory which best accounts for the evidence we have and is liable to revision in the light of other. Yeah, that's bollocks. It is philosophically true, but you know deep in your heart that it's true that the theory of evolution is true. That was a bit mangled, but you got the point. Historians work in the same way. A historic figure is not the blood and bones figure of history. It's the best explanation in a narrative for the evidence we have about that figure. So the historic Abraham Lincoln, who obviously definitely existed, is not Abraham Lincoln. It's, and I'm talking strictly professionally here, not, from the heart, as it were. It's the best explanation you can get for why Abraham Lincoln did this, based on the evidence which historians use, and that is just mainly textual evidence. We're obsessed with texts, letters, diaries, government records, that kind of thing. So we construct a narrative. Now, do we think that's close enough to what Abraham Lincoln did? Of course. What would the point in writing it if we thought it was just nonsense and was just words on a page? But philosophically, a historical figure like Jesus, and I said this is where I'm going to lose half your audience from this, is a historical construct which best explains the evidence available to us. That is the purely philosophical historical answer. But deep down, if I can construct a convincing enough narrative about the actual Jesus, then I'm going to go, well, probably it did exist like that, something like that anyway.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I can see that. And I mean, to continue with your comparison with evolution, I agree with you that evolutionary theory is a construct to explain the evidence. But when I say I believe in evolution and I fully accept it, what that means is, yes, I'm open to revision, that my acceptance of the theory is provisional, but at the same time, I have a body of things that I can pluck out. Observations that are concrete and testable and confirmed over and over again. So like you say, the theory is something that best explains this magnificent body of evidence. The question with somebody like Jesus is, though, do you have the equivalent kinds of nuggets of fact?
The answer is not anywhere near like what you're talking about. History is not science. Right. We can't do it with mathematical certainty. What we can do is construct a narrative which could be overturned by new evidence. I might find a new letter from Abraham Lincoln which completely overthrows what we'd previously considered about Abraham Lincoln. Somebody else might construct a better narrative. And of course, that's why historians keep writing books about Abraham Lincoln, because they believe they've got a better narrative than somebody before them. So it is not the same as science, but there are parallels in this truth claims versus, sort of just the methodology of the discipline. So we make one claim within the methodology, that is, this is just tentative, but deep down, once we've constructed our historical figure, we tend to believe in it. If that makes sense?
Well, yeah. I mean, so to continue with Abraham Lincoln, then the thing is, you could find new evidence about Abraham Lincoln, and maybe something that would completely undermine our perspective on him as a person.
And we're not going to do that with Jesus. All the evidence we have is already existent. So it's about rereading it, and people do reread it in new ways. And I could give you, can I do an example of what I mean by this, which would probably help, make it more concrete for your viewers? I'll go back to the resurrection very briefly. I say we've got 4 accounts of the resurrection, and then we've got lots of other sort of accounts which are not included in the Christian Bible. But just sticking to the 4 accounts we've got, here's a possible explanation, and this is the one, of course, William Lane Craig takes. He says the best historical explanation for the evidence given in the Gospels is that Jesus really rose from the dead. It's how he argues. It is a narrative which does explain the Gospels accounting for it. It does. I mean, it's not the one I buy, because I think it has.
What did we say that? So,
but I think it has problems, and I'm not even talking about being an atheist or being a methodological naturalist or anything. It has problems. Then that's all it can account for. It can't account for the subsequent history of Christianity, like why did so many different faith groups spring up with different beliefs about what this Jesus character was like, what his resurrection meant. They all agreed he died and resurrected, otherwise they wouldn't have been Christian. They would have stayed either being Jewish or pagans. But once they've got that, there was no agreement. So if you've got this miraculous, body from the grave, and we can use ordinary historical tools to explain the early faith communities, why do we have these? It seems ad hoc to throw in an actual resurrection when we can use ordinary historical tools for explaining how the faith communities developed after the resurrection, if that makes sense.
Yes, and it also fits with a scientific perspective, which is you extrapolate from what is known, and we have no experience with people resurrecting magically after being dead for 3 days.
Absolutely, and as a historian, of course, I do work in that realm, but you almost try not to. What if I could be convinced that, given all of the facts, then the resurrection must have happened, or at least something very similar to it, to explain the evidence we have? As it happens, I can explain many facts about Jesus' life without needing, miracles. And intuitively to me, it seems a better explanation if they can be explained without miracles than needing the miracles. So
consilience with the natural world, and so you throw out the stuff that doesn't fit with how the world works.
Not a priori. As I said, I don't need to work that way with William Lane Craig's argument. It's an ad hoc throwing in. When the rest of it can be explained naturally, why would you suddenly have a different explanation for the resurrection from all the stuff that led up to the resurrection, followed by all the stuff coming after the resurrection? You suddenly force a miracle into the middle. Why wouldn't you use the same methodological explanation to explain all of it?
This is something I run into with creationists all the time, who are trying desperately to make scientific justifications for their mythology. And it's like, we're gonna figure out how you could fit X number of species in a big boat. And okay, you can't, but why are you even trying to do this? Why can't you just say a miracle happened and make it a miracle throughout? Then I can't address it. But the minute they try to play these games and say they've got a rational, logical, scientific justification for something that's patently silly, they lose me.
Well, I would actually not. I mean, one of the things that William Lane Craig's claim of the resurrection is, it's clearly not silly. There are millions of faith believers who share his view on the resurrection. I would be very hesitant to call it a silly view. It's not one I share, but it is a view held by millions and millions of people, and even more throughout all of history. It also does, in his eyes, explain the historical evidence, although I would argue that if I could explain it away, he'd still probably stick with his resurrection, even if I could explain the resurrection differently. But on the other extreme, let's go to the other extreme. What's the easiest way? Seems to be an easy way to explain the resurrection. There never was a Jesus, strictly fictional from start to finish. So it's easy to resurrect him because all you got to do is write it down on a piece of paper. If he never existed as a body, a living body, he never existed as a dead body. Therefore, a resurrected body is just some words on a page. This is an extreme mythicist position, and I'm not even sure that many mythicists would go quite that far as to deny that there was anything going on in the early first century in Palestine. But again, this is also equally ad hoc. I'm not sticking to the resurrection alone here. We have these communities who quickly develop texts and stories about a real Jesus. How are we going to account for? You need another explanation on top of the mythicist one to keep going. So again, it doesn't flow linearly across the story. We have to somebody makes it up, and then what? We're going to need a conspiracy theory almost of people, being bullied into believing in this fictional character and then writing about him as if he was real. And it just doesn't. If there is another explanation that works better, strikes me that neither the extreme mythicist nor the traditional view, that the Christian view that the resurrection actually happened, satisfy a sort of linear view of how this faith community started. And just to sort of spoiler, started with one bloke, I believe, called Jesus, and ended, ends today. Well, hasn't ended today. You might want it to, but it's still very much going on in 2018. Right. And we can use very similar historical techniques. But when it comes to the Jesus figure, and this is the question, of course, that people want an answer to, there isn't a simple answer. The answer is that for the evidence that we have from the earliest texts, and I say the four Gospels are amazing, amazing pieces of evidence. It's what you do with the evidence that matters, but they are amazing. They're written in ancient terms, really close to Jesus. I know that some people will not like to hear that something written from about 70 for the earliest to about 85, 90 for the last is close to a bloke that probably died about 33, 34 AD. But in terms of ancient worlds, having these texts and knowing that they've been faithfully, and of course they were faithfully transmitted, as soon as they became scripture, you don't mess around with this stuff. You transmit it as faithfully as you can. They weren't written as scripture, they were written as biographies. But they quickly became scripture.
Let me contrast that, though, with another religion, because you're saying, okay, it's highly unlikely that there was this conspiracy to assemble a Jesus myth. But then something like Mormonism, where we would all agree Joseph Smith was a historical figure, right? He's
absolutely, yep.
He's real, but he invented this ridiculous past history for the North American continent. So he invented whole civilizations, and people believe this.
They do. This is not a question of what they believe. Again, we'd have to account for the evidence. And I can't speak on, my knowledge of Mormonism is probably one chapter in one historical book on, an introduction to how weird Americans are, which I should own more of.
We're very weird. Yeah.
You really are weird. You wear baseball caps at breakfast. So any historical account of the growth of Mormonism, though, can use standard historical techniques. And it would start with a real Joseph Smith and, a real Brigham Young and things. So again, it's not so much a question of individual psychologies, although that will come up from time to time when you're dealing with critically little evidence. We've probably got, I don't know, I've never studied Mormonism, but I imagine that the volumes in Salt Lake City on its history must be immense in their archives, just on the history of the thing alone. I imagine that one historian could never complete going through those archives to write a decent sort of a history, but it can still be done using the tools of history. So it's the fact that lots of people believe patently silly things about golden spectacles and golden planks and ancient Egyptian scripts, which nobody else can ever identify, is neither here nor there. We can still use the tools of history to look at, and we can analyze the Book of Mormon itself in an almost literary critical style to go, does this bit sound like it was ripped out of the King James? Does this bit sound familiar? Are the attitudes towards black people the sort of attitudes you would expect from a man in the 1820s? Writing this? And of course the answer will probably turn out to be yes. All of that stated, I'd like to re-emphasize again, I have no knowledge of the history of Mormonism beyond the very basic chapter in the book.
Back to that issue I brought up earlier. So we can safely say something about the history of Mormonism, and we can talk about historical facts, we can confirm them, we can use evidence, and we can have this picture of what was going on in 1820 in North America. But that does not give any credence at all to the mythology behind that.
Okay, right. So here we need to move again, and now we have to make a theological move with apologies for this.
Okay.
Okay. This move might explain a little bit about what a historian means by the historical Jesus. So just bear with me with a tiny little story. The earliest accounts of Jesus we have are the writings of Paul. About 2 decades before even the first gospel. Now, Paul seems to believe that this historical figure, Jesus, becomes Christ, the Greek word for Messiah, at his death. Maybe his resurrection, but since they're within 2 days of each other, it's about the same time, give or take. So Paul wants to know, when did Jesus become this Messiah, the anointed one who is going to save us all? And Paul reckons it's at the death, resurrection bit. This isn't good enough, though, for the gospel writers who go, well, what would make God single out this one man's death? There has to be something special beforehand. So one gospel writer pushes it back to a baptism and says when John the Baptist anointed him, then the skies opened, a dove flew down, or at least it has clearly a metaphor. It does say the Holy Spirit descended like a dove. It doesn't actually say a dove. And so a voice says, this is my son. I think he's quite cool, or rough words to those effects. So this gospel writer is going, well, this explains it. Then another gospel writer went, it didn't, of course, happen in this linear narrative. These are faith communities arguing with each other sort of before they're writing these texts, but it makes more fun if you do it as a linear narrative. Another gospel writer goes, hang on, what if I push the messiahship back to birth and make it a holy, birth, something magical about the birth? So from the moment he's born, he's identified as a special man. He becomes the Messiah from birth. And in fact, brief tangent, but I love this one, and some people might be interested. The virgin birth is not as miraculous as most people think. As I'm sure you're aware, conception used to be thought of as the woman produces the matter and then bakes the baby, but the man produces the blueprint, just injects a blueprint. So if God injects the blueprint, the woman's still producing all the matter and baking the baby. Yes, of course, it's a miracle because it's God did it, but it's nowhere near as miraculous as it sounds to us with our knowledge of chromosomes and things. It's just an injected blueprint into Mary's body, and not, a 23 half chromosome, my knowledge of genetics obviously showing very strongly there, sort of a thing. So the virgin birth would not have come as a complete shock to the first readers, going, well, sure, if God can make man out of clay, how easy just to inject, a blueprint into a woman's body. Yeah. It would have seemed much less miraculous than we think it is. I quite like that.
Yeah. At the same time, you will find some Christians who make arguments about chromosome numbers in Jesus, which
is silly.
Anachronistic. It's totally irrelevant to the story that was told. Yeah, and it,
But so then just to finish off this one story, then ultimately we end up with the Gospel of John, who goes, bugger this, I'm not having him just become Christ, this Jesus figure become Christ, the anointed one, at birth. I'm going to push him back as far as possible, which is to infinity backwards. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and so on and so forth, in the beautiful, beautiful words of the King James translation of Gospel of John. So, of course, I just presented that linearly as if each had read the previous one and wanted to kick it back. It would have been different groups, each with their own conception of when Jesus became the Messiah. Sort of the earliest one we can identify as Paul. Then we've got other versions going, he probably became the Messiah, at baptism. Others going, he became the Messiah at birth. So I'm going, no, screw it. He was the Messiah forever. He always existed in some mysterious, quite unknown way. I do this to split the historical Jesus from this figure Christ.
Yeah.
These are discussions that are going on about. So if a naive atheist, not talking about you or necessarily any of your things, would go, oh, the miracle stories, the resurrection sounds silly, so there can't have been a real person, behind it. But we can account in using standard historical techniques for why we have a virgin birth. It's part of an ongoing discussion of at what point does Jesus become the Messiah?
Right. Now, you see, basically what you've admitted, though, is that there was probably a kernel of truth somewhere in there, but we clearly see evidence that those faith communities were adding layers of myth to it.
Okay, the myth is, yes, they certainly are myths, and they're myths in the most technical sense, is they're myths which explain their practices and their beliefs, not just myths as in made-up fairy stories. These people are not doing this. Obviously think of the respect the early Christians had for the figure of Jesus, sort of whom they did expect to imminently return as well. So they wouldn't have wanted to mess around with his stories. But when you read these biographies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have to remember that when they write them, they're not lying. You have to give them that. But what they are is writing them in a first century way, which is not our way, which means that the meaning of a story about Jesus is much more important than what we would consider to be a totally accurate version. So when Matthew, I think it's Matthew who writes about the virgin birth, I'm pretty sure it is, did he believe it? Probably, but it's not as important to him. It's about what it conveys about this nature of messiahship, of Christness, that, and it's thing. But that doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't born, just because Matthew has an explanation for at what point.
Okay. But this is my historical problem, because we're willing to say, and I'm fully prepared to concede, yeah, these were rational people who were trying to make sense of the world the best they could. They weren't lying. They weren't insane. They were just fitting things as best they could into their worldview.
And
So,
writing in a way which we don't write anymore. That's the other thing you have to remember. You can't just read them as if they were writing in 2018. They have their own conventions and styles.
yes, and it would be anachronistic for me to expect that they would write like modern historians. Okay, but now what we've just said is that, yeah, they added all these stories that made sense to the core myth of Jesus. And
They added myth. They did indeed add myths. But again, myths are not lies. Not for them.
I agree. But the question is where did the myth making start and end, and where was the reality?
Okay, right.
Is it
This is
that there was no Jesus, but they just invented this character to fit their legends that would explain the
too many different faith communities, all with the same figure of Jesus. You've got the very, very early Gentile communities, mostly Greek-speaking, but very quickly some Latin-speaking communities. You've got some Jewish communities, nowhere near as many as people would like to think. It didn't take up that strongly. In fact, after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, Judaism had a huge resurgence, and many Christians. Why we think actually the Gospel of Luke was written to deal with some people who are thinking of falling away from Christianity and going back to their traditional Judaism. Maybe. That's speculative, but it does account for the introduction and a few other lines in it. So too many different faith communities, all with the same one core figure. How much of a conspiracy do you want of a lost text, a lost, unknown thing, which then strangely spread with remarkably similar stories, although key differences, like when did the Christness descend on Jesus? For you would need to some way of explaining, and I have never heard anyone with a convincing explanation as to how this could become without a small group of individuals. It has to start small, and they have to believe. And I know that this is going to sound a bit like a conventional Christian argument. Oh, the first disciples, they really believed, therefore it must all be true. Well, I'm actually going to argue something very similar without the miracles. They all believed, so it must be true. That's, of course, not a very good historical thing, but it's a subjective, way of seeing that it must have spread from somewhere. And I can't see anybody who could convince me that there is such an early if Jesus never existed, where are the faith communities who worshipped, an ethereal spirit and never believed in his actual body? We found them 200 years later, so we know that some people were capable of thinking this, but there are no early faith communities. What, a conspiracy theory? We burnt all the texts? This is, it's...
Yeah.
You've got to have some explanations for this. And if you're going to suggest that all the texts were burnt, I'm sorry, but this argument by Lack, I can prove that, Abraham Lincoln was in fact an 8-foot-tall lizard, but we burnt all the texts that prove it. It's just very inconvenient.
Right, but I would not make that argument. That sounds like a silly argument. So no, I wouldn't make that, I would hope. But the thing is, I can imagine mythologies spreading pretty rapidly based on the psychological appeal of the story.
Of course.
So,
and especially when as well written as the Gospels were, except for Mark. Mark is really badly written.
Yeah. Or when it's got this little tiny kernel of truth. And I'm for instance, I am fully on by the idea that there were hordes of apocalyptic rabbis wandering around in Judea and
Yep.
about 0 AD. So then you just take those and you assemble those. So let's contrast it with something. So, for example, Robin Hood.
Mhm.
Robin Hood a real historical figure? I hear that.
Oh God, he. This is again something that would annoy the hell out of non-historians if they ever went to historical conferences. Robin Hood goes in and out of being a historical figure with every generation.
Exactly.
I think he's a historical figure at the moment, but I wouldn't swear to that. I know that when I was at Cambridge several decades ago, the master of my college was obsessed with, finding the real Robin Hood from a historical perspective, not just, from a digging it up in an archaeological way in a wood. So he was definitely around in the early 90s as a real figure. By the late 90s, I think you'd be surprised to find that once every 40, 50 years, Socrates stops being a real figure. These are things that happen in the historical community because somebody finds an explanation for the same facts and that narrative takes hold. This would infuriate non-historians. Of course, we don't write out books like that. Can you imagine picking up a book, again, let's stick to Abraham Lincoln, in which the preface said, I don't really hold a word of this to be true. It's just an assemblage of things which best explain the archival data. Nobody would read that biography. You want it to at least believe that the historian believes it to be
Right.
true,
Well, but
deep down.
let's contrast. I mean, you've got Robin Hood, who's what, 12th century estimated. He's
Well, you can have King Arthur if you want. King Arthur was probably real now. He wasn't a generation ago. King Arthur's real again now.
busy. Okay. Well, that's another good example. So, here we got these two figures, King Arthur and Robin Hood.
Mhm.
And, King Arthur was what, 5th, 6th century AD. And Robin Hood was what, 12th century?
12, something like that, especially if you believe the Disney movie.
Oh, if we possibly was actually. And, for instance, you could compare Robin Hood to Eleanor of Aquitaine, where we got loads of data, we got dates, we got events,
Absolutely.
other people.
Yep.
And King Arthur, you compare him to, for instance, Belisarius of Byzantium.
True, but then you've got exactly a problem which is there. So how much do we have on Eleanor and Aquitaine? The amount we would expect for a member of the royal family. How much evidence do we have for an outlaw who only later had more mythology grow about him? About the amount we would expect for one outlaw who later had more mythology grow around him. How much evidence is there for King Arthur? Well, for one Briton who tried to fight off the English, which is the current fashionable theory, well, it has been for some time now, about the amount we would expect for one British general fighting off the English. It's not, so of course there's more evidence for people who were members of the royal family or popes, or Abraham Lincoln. How much evidence do we have for one a Galilean preacher whom the Romans put a stop to all this nonsense with one easy move of crucifying him? And as we know, that stopped all of this nonsense. Nobody ever heard of him again. We have exactly the amount of evidence we would expect from the sources at the time, until later people start putting this and committing this to paper. Certain faith communities decide to copy these pieces of paper, transmit these pieces of paper, and that, of course, is about the year 70 where the Gospels take off. We have exactly the amount of evidence I would expect for one troublemaking preacher, and that is later accounts of stories which are difficult to try and unpick, but there are accounts which can be made which look convincing to create a historic Jesus. Now, it's going to sound really pedantic and almost solipsistic in some ways. The historic Jesus is not Jesus. The historic Jesus is the best narrative account we can use, the evidence we have to explain the origins of the evidence that we have in front of us. Now, do I believe that when I've constructed that, not I, obviously I've never constructed my own Jesus, but when I've read convincing accounts, do I then believe in that Jesus? Well, just like any scientist, I hope, who is convinced by the theory of relativity, they can hold it philosophically in their head that this is liable to review, but deep down they know it's true. So the story I'm most convinced by about Jesus meets all the requirements of meeting at least more of the evidence than it fails to meet. Whereas the multiple Galilean theories, the never existing theory, and the straightforward was born of a virgin, died, rose on the 3-day theory don't meet my requirements for matching the
Yes.
majority of the evidence we have.
Oh.
I know that's going to sound academic and solipsistic, but that's actually how we historians really work when we're pushed.
Well, I'm an academic. I know how we think. Yeah. This still doesn't. This still has a problem for me in that. Yes, I would agree that we wouldn't expect much evidence from about a Jewish rabble rouser who was executed in 33 AD or whatever. And the amount of evidence we have for that is zero, right? We just
No. We have the Gospels. I want to keep going back to this. Now, they're difficult to use. You can't just read them and go, that's what happened. For a start, they're mutually contradictory. And that in itself is fascinating because the first compiler, and they've filed as 4 Gospels very, very early on in Christianity, like seriously early on, shortly after the last one was written, basically, didn't feel any need to try and sort out one overall account. They went, we've got 4 faith communities, 4 different versions of Jesus. I'm quite happy slapping together, distributing them as a compilation. They were called the 4-in-1, the Gospels. So that alone is evidence that lots of things were circulating. There was knowledge. The stories do not just arise with these 4 Gospels. There is a whole faith. These Gospels are written to feed a faith community that already has stories circulating. Now, we've lost these? We project them back. We invent one called Q. When I say we invent, we construct. I should be much more polite to the believers in Q. I'm skeptical for a number of reasons, and we can never do anything about it. I think it exists, but I don't know if it's one document, 40 or whatever. So we do know that these Gospels were written for faith communities. In fact, Luke, in his opening, says it is. These are faith communities that are pre-textual. They're telling them as each other about stories about Jesus. They're drinking. We know that they're drinking the cup and eating the bread. We know they're reciting the Lord's Prayer. These are things we can tell from the Gospels, and also from some tiny amounts of other evidence about Christian practices from elsewhere. So no, it's not the case that the stories about Jesus suddenly spring into existence. They are first committed to paper about this time. And therefore the Gospels are evidence, but you have to be really careful with what you do with them. You don't just read them and go, well, it says on a Thursday morning he was here, so I assume on that particular Thursday morning he was there. You ask questions. What's the purpose of the story? What is our writer trying to convey? Is there a political point? Is there a bigger spiritual point? Does this sound? And even then, I don't care where Jesus was on a particular Thursday. The bigger mission, the whole thing, his big mission, as I understand it, is so interesting that the minutiae about did he really try to feed 5,000 or did they fail for a mass solution? I'm not interested. I'm interested in the core thing that his disciples picked up on, which was God is everywhere. This centralized temple is complicit with Roman occupation. We need to get rid of this temple system and return to more localized worship of Yahweh, which his disciples probably got muddled up with a simple mission to overthrow Rome, decided he was the Messiah, he dies. They are then somehow traumatized by this. Obviously, you would. I imagine some of them went, fuck that, went home, I'm not having any more messiahs. Some of the disciples would have gone on to the next messiah candidate. But enough of them decided to reinterpret his death to mean something much, much more important now than just kicking Rome out of it, or just kicking the temple out with its complicity. And especially after the temple's destruction in AD 70, that must have meant a lot to early Christians going, didn't Jesus say the temple was bad? Look, it's gone now. This Jesus must be really important. Okay. So if that makes, so all of that is a very brief account of a historical figure, and if you treat it like that, makes sense of a lot of the evidence. And the Gospels are, as I keep stressing, as the letters of Paul, evidence. You just have to be careful how you treat the evidence.
Yes, and you have to be careful how you interpret what they're evidence of. So, for example, I would agree with you that 70 AD or thereabouts, whenever that first one was written down, that wasn't the start of Christianity. That was the point where it was laid out.
Paul is 20 years earlier, and he's writing to faith communities all across Europe.
Okay, so 50 AD, whatever. Somewhere in there we get this concrete, factual, historical evidence of the existence of a faith community. And I think it's also reasonable to infer that that faith community didn't just suddenly spring into existence. It wasn't like Scientology, where some guy just says, okay, now this is the way it is, and boom, you can track it to an instant. We can assume that there was this slow dissemination of oral stories.
Much faster. Bart Ehrman's work shows that the spread of Christianity was really rapid, as rapid basically as communication routes allowed. There was something in the cultural psyches at the time that really wanted this message.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is that we can assume that prior to that writing down, that stuff that we can actually measure historically, there were also decades of stories that were told among these faith communities.
And we know some of them because but the interesting thing is we can compare that. That's why this is why we're so lucky to have 4 Gospels.
Yeah.
Because we can look at the reliance on Mark's narrative in Matthew and Luke, and then we can ask, what did they bring to the table? What are the differences there? What sort of debates are going on between these faith communities that meant they're either undermining Mark, supporting Mark, criticizing Mark? What are they doing with the Markine material? Gives us an insight into, the different attitudes. So that does actually lead us backwards, because it tells us the sort of stories that faith community grew up on, which were different to the ones that the Markine faith community grew up on. And then we can start to track back, with little family trees until we come to a single common ancestor who I'm going to call Jesus.
But that's an inference.
Of course.
We don't. So we have evidence of the Gospels, which tell us about the faith communities and what they believed. But all that stuff below that is reasonable inference that gets progressively murkier the farther back you go.
Yes, and that's how ancient history works. It just is. I mean, if you want mathematical proof of Jesus's existence, then I'm afraid ancient history is not. I remember, this is a little story about me, and the best stories are always about me. Many years ago, I was researching an aspect of a very trivial aspect, but an interesting one for me, on Edgar Allan Poe and his attitude towards slavery. And I was ranting at a party about how I couldn't sort out this particular thing. I couldn't find the evidence. I knew the evidence was there somewhere, couldn't find it. And a very nice lady said, why didn't we ask Poe? And I asked her what she meant by this. And she said, I'll do a seance. I'm a medium. I'll do a seance. We'll ask Poe for you. I regret to this day not taking her up on offer, just so I could have written a footnote, personal communication, Edgar Allan Poe to author, 2005, and just seeing what the reviewers would have made of that sort of in a footnote. That's the kind of evidence you're going to have, I'm afraid, if you want to know the truth about Jesus. You're actually going to need Jesus to speak to you personally. And of course, for many people around the world, he does speak to them personally, but the historical community will not accept the footnote, personal communication, Jesus to author, 2018. We don't accept that as a legitimate way of doing history. Perhaps we should. It would shake up the history profession quite a bit, because we'd have the ultimate truth about everything.
Right, but here we're still having this problem. Yeah, that I agree. We don't expect mathematical certainty of the existence of Jesus. And if you ask me personally, I would say, sure, it's possible. It's also possible he didn't exist.
Right. But I think, I can't convince you here. To convince you, I'd have to sit down with all the various sources and look at this, and we'd be into minutiae at one point, which I can't do. For example, I'm not fluent in Koine Greek. I can't argue the minutiae over the texts with you. But it is actually very uncontroversial in historical circles that Jesus existed. really uncontroversial. It is seen as the most convincing explanation for the evidence we have of both the texts and the earth spread, and the differences and the similarities between those early faith communities, that the not existing one doesn't meet the criteria of explanatory power of all the evidence, as well as the single existing person who was there crucified, and his disciples had to find some meaning for that crucifixion. That actually fits the evidence much, much better than the not existing at all person. Now, if you're looking for the historical truth about what height was he, what was his eye color, well, again, I recommend getting down on your knees by the side of your bed and having him personally tell you, because that is the only source of information you're going to get for that kind of stuff. Although they were brown and he was probably short.
Yeah.
We just know that because that's what the average first century Galilean looked like.
Yeah, but again, the fact that there is a consensus among historians doesn't necessarily mean anything. That, for instance, if we go back 200 years ago, there was a consensus among scientists that phlogiston existed, and so the key thing is, show me the chain of evidence and the logic that you use to derive this.
Right. I can't. I can't. I literally can't
Right.
on this particular chat. I mean, it's the best way I could do it was be literally picking up something like one of Bart Ehrman's excellent books. I mean, I know that they're trade books and not academic books. If you read stuff by people like Bart Ehrman, I recommend you don't, because they are full of the minutiae of this inflection on this Greek vowel, on this corresponds with this particular one over here. I want the one-line summary from the expert going, this was checked by somebody who knows what they're talking about and this is what it means. I can't stand the page. It doesn't interest me, those pages and pages and pages of comparing particular, verb constructions in Greek to look at this kind of evidence. I just want the headline summary of that stuff. But I have to trust the experts, as I'm sure you do. I mean, I'm going to guess you're not an expert on quantum physics.
No.
So if you needed something that would, tiny little things going through brains that might have quantum fields, you would have to rely on the quantum physicists and the majority opinion of the quantum. Is quantum physicist even the right word? I assume they are quantum physicists. You'd have to rely on them to tell you what you need. Now, it could be subject to revision, but I have to rely on people who are experts in certain fields to do that. Unfortunately, that lot of that donkey work for me, like the Greek verb construction stuff, which is utterly necessary in this field. To be able to do biblical studies, you have to do, Koine Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Aramaic. You also help a few other extinct Middle Eastern. We don't need a god. We've got people like Bart Ehrman who understand about 8 extinct languages. He'll do fine as my god.
Well,
I don't know anyone else who could do that.
So to make an analogy that I'm more familiar with is, we can do bioinformatics and we can compare 2 species, and we can infer a last common ancestor and what kind of attributes they had. And that's a body of expertise where, if you read bioinformatics, you will go blind because it's all, it's weird stuff. And yeah, you would say, okay, well, I'm going to rely on the experts to tell me that there was a common ancestor of these 2 species. But then if you talk to the experts, we will tell you, well, it's an inference that we're pretty sure that this existed on the basis of concrete evidence here. But
and
could be wrong.
And I agree. Oh, absolutely. And I'll go back. The history is I don't know about when you go to conferences, but there's nothing historians like more than disproving another historian or actually my professional code, it says I can never attack another historian. I don't know anyone who abides by our professional code. It's actually in my professional code of conduct. I'm a member of the Professional Historians Association. I can never attack another historian in public. Can do it in private in the conferences and the meetings, but I must never commit to print to insult another historian. By insult, they mean show they're wrong. We do it all the time, all of the time. Nobody abides by that rule in the professional thing.
We're always going after each other, so it's okay.
So yeah, so one of the reasons is, and there are competing. Unfortunately, it was not very good. Here's me attacking a historian. Reza Aslan's book Zealot, which had all that. I only picked up, only ever heard of course, after that infamous Fox News interview on him demanding to know why he's a Muslim and what right he has to write about Jesus. If you remember that controversy a couple of years ago.
Yes.
So I picked up. It's not very good. Unfortunately, it's not a convincing. That is, it's not a convincing account. It's quite well written, but it doesn't convince particularly well. And in history, the rhetoric, the message is the medium. If I can convince you through my narrative that it meets all the... there are much more boring historians, by the way, who just go through numbers and try to count how many sheep were in England in 1200, but that's not my kind of history at all. So the message is the medium. So is the Jesus of today, the historic Jesus, by which I mean the Jesus constructed by a historian, going to be the same Jesus as a Jesus constructed by a historian 10 years' time? I bloody hope not, because I'd like to see more people doing research, and coming up with new things. But deep down, still means we really do believe there was a Jesus that's worth writing about in the first place, who gave rise to this historic account that we're trying to do. I say we. I keep claiming credit for all these experts.
Yeah, I still have problems with this because I think what most of these serious historians are writing about Jesus, but they're writing about him as a construct that gave rise to this vast body of evidence that we have at a later time. Yeah. And that does not demonstrate to me that there had to have been one man rather than a dozen obscure Jewish rabbis.
As I say, I can't convince you over this brief chat here. Yeah. But and I'm not the expert, that you should be going for the technical side. But I've read this. I mean, it is a bit of obsession of mine, early Christianity. I'm in love with the subject matter for reasons which are probably biographical. It's all about my dad, probably always is. All history is just autobiography put down on the page for consumption by others. That's what somebody wants to.
This is why I'm obsessed with fish, because my dad was.
So, the one rabbi, well, he wasn't even a rabbi. Rabbis don't even exist until after the fall of the temple, which is an interesting thing to note, because it was all Jewish priests. There were no rabbis before the fall of the temple. So the one preacher, the radical preacher, fits the facts better than the multiple. Now, I can only state that. I know it's not going to be convincing, me sitting here going, trust me on this. Just trust me on this. It does. But if you read enough, and you probably won't, because I can't imagine anyone wanting to sit through some of the books that I've read, and I don't want to sit through them again, it does fit the evidence. It makes a little bit more sense of this bit of evidence here, this bit of evidence here, this bit which never quite worked on somebody else's thing suddenly slots into place on this reading of the story. And when you get that, in history terms, it just switches on and you go, yeah, I know it's a construct. And as I started at the start, philosophically, it's tentative, it's not anything to do with a real person. It's just a construct which explains the evidence that we have found in the archive. But deep down, when it makes sense, we tend to believe it's true because it just feels true.
Okay, let me take a different approach then. What would convince me that you were correct, that there was one radical preacher? And so the kinds of things I would like to see that would require detailed analysis by historians trained in this period is, for instance, does the Jesus message, the religious text that he is inspiring, contradict or oppose or differ greatly from the general consensus of what was emerging out of that area at that time? So that would tell me that there was something unique, some unique message.
And a historian would find that unconvincing. We are much more convinced if it fits with the general patterns. Yes, of course, there are exceptional individuals throughout history, and Jesus must have been exceptional at least to the community group that followed him, what we now call disciples. Must have been exceptional. Maybe it was just very charismatic. But we are far more convinced as historians if you can go, well, that's just typical. Much more likely to convince us if the evidence shows, well, this is what first century radical preachers said. This is the kind of message they were having. If if he's going to come down and say, no, actually, I think you should buy shares in titanium in 2,000 years' time, it's going to go through the roof. We get suspicious about those kind of explanations or sources of people. We tend to suspect that's not the kind of person we expect. So no, the more ordinary, the more typical they are. I'm sorry, we historians are a perverse lot deliberately to annoy scientists. It's just how we were trained.
Okay, but here's what bothers me about that. Then that idea that this was just general stuff that was simmering out of Palestine at that time is compatible with the idea that Jesus is a composite of a great many different religious speakers.
No,
And,
I mean, you don't need that at all. The evidence we have, how many things can I tell you? And I'm going to, again, state this without evidence, but it should hopefully not be that radical. It's certainly not that controversial in historical terms. How many things can I guarantee that Jesus definitely said? I can guarantee two things. One is some version of the Lord's Prayer, possibly a slightly simplified version of the version that you may have recited. Obviously, it would also be in Aramaic and not in English.
yeah.
But and something very, very close to take, eat, this is my body. Take, drink, this is my blood. How do we know this? Because these are among the core first rituals. Paul talks effectively, not effectively, literally, about, or at least gives enough implications that we now know that's what he's talking about. He doesn't necessarily, he never quotes the words of Jesus, but he's talking about rituals that are going on in the thing. So how do we know that? Because that's likely the core that is at the center of the faith. Initially, it's this one ritual, this bread and wine ritual, and a little prayer that Jesus, which is important because it's not traditionally Jewish. If you want something different, this is a God is everywhere prayer, which is part of what we believe Jesus' message to be, along with other preachers at the time. He's not that. There are others, but so we don't need these other preachers to composite into Jesus. That's part of the myth, not the real person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The myth building, because then the myth building comes on that. But this myth building, and as a different historian will tell you that they might be sure the Jesus Project has compiled a list of, things that Jesus never said, things Jesus might have said, and things Jesus definitely did say, based on some very hard work and a lot of thinking. And I'm not going to criticize them, obviously, because they're infinitely more expertise than I have in this discipline. But I don't see much use to that. I don't see much use. I'm much more interested after that point. By the time we got to the Gospels, I'm more interested in what Christians did with them.
Right. Well, this is getting back to the point I was making earlier, though, because, if I take a cladistic approach to biology, for instance, what I'm interested in is not the commonalities, not the stuff that an entire wide group necessarily shares, but I'm interested in the shared derived characters, the ones that are unique to that particular species or that group. And what you just gave was an example of, the whole idea of the Lord's Prayer and the ritual. Those seem to be the kinds of things I'm looking for. This is something unique to this particular strain of religiosity emerging out of that region.
Yes.
And
it's only unique identifying factors, basically, initially.
Right. So then the question is, are there other Jewish groups that were existing at the same time that have similar sorts of traits?
Not with this particular, not with the emphasis. There's several Jewish meals, the Passover for one, where you sit and you share bread and wine, but you don't obsess over it in the way that early Christians did. This whole idea that this was linking you into, well, effectively the body corporate, the wider Christian community. By the act of partaking in this bread and wine, this made you part, whereas a Jewish person would see it as a symbolic thing, or or sometimes even just a literally family get together. Yeah. It could have religious symbolism, but they didn't obsess over it in the way that the early Christians obsessed with this. And we know this because there are some pagan writers sneer at Christians for their obsession over this bread and wine ritual. They they effectively accuse it as you'll probably find somebody on the internet now sneering at Christians for having cannibalistic urges, and eating the body and blood. Early pagans did the same. There's nothing new in that accusation against Christians.
Yeah, I mean, that's to me, that's the interesting point, is that you could make an argument that the early Christians were so out of tune with the general consensus of what religions were doing at that time, that they had their own very unique traits,
and
that
they did.
you could
But
then
they developed. I mean, we don't know, obviously. Whilst I can say I'm pretty sure that Jesus did perform some version of his own slightly odd version of the Passover. For a start, if it's accurately recorded, he inverted the traditional Jewish way of which way round you have the bread and the wine. Maybe for symbolism, maybe it accidentally got misreported. I couldn't tell you which way round it is. Lots and lots of ink has been spilled. Lots of ink has been spilled on that debate, though. But did Jesus know when he did that shortly after his death, his followers would remember one key thing? Do you remember that night when he said, did Jesus know he was doing something so fascinating? I mean, that, of course, is then into the realm of, well, you'd be better off doing historical fiction if you want to, than actual history, if you want to get into that. But the reason is we think it must have been Jesus is their obsession over that and all the faith. It is the only thing, basically, that links all early faith communities that identified as Christian, is this obsession over this bread and wine business. So something triggered that. And unless you want a very odd conspiracy, it seems the most probable explanation is the person they believe to be the founder, or at least a very significant figure, for reasons that they then spent the next 300 years trying to figure out, was he adopted by God? Was he God? And then you get into, your whole Roman adoption, and so on and so forth and so forth. But no, the easiest explanation for that ritual is that one person did it. Not that a whole group of Galileans were going around doing it, but it's odd. It's not typical of its era, but nor is it possibly something as radical as it was made into. Maybe Jesus just thought this was a way of binding his immediate followers around him, or something. I could speculate endlessly on what Jesus was thinking. But his followers came to believe, especially after his death. Do you remember that night? Of course, I'm talking about the immediate followers, who then spread you must also take the bread and the wine. And that's what binds the Christian community together.
Okay, so let me just kind of summarize where I stand with this then. That I think the strong evidence for this idea, again, comparing it to my biology expertise, is that there is a shared derived character to the Christian religion that implies or suggests that there was a single last common ancestor of this now very diverse faith tradition. And that seems reasonable to me. But again, I would still say that's very much a stretch. That's very much an inference from the available data. And it could, as I would say with any putative last common ancestor in the evolutionary tree, I would say it's subject to revision given further data.
And it is. But the thing is, professionally, the further back you go, the less evidence you have to work with. Unless you turn to those damned archaeologists who are always trying to poke their nose into our business, by the way, and tell us that we're wrong on occasions. We don't like them at all, because they try to produce things and explain that this thing has a meaning. We don't like that. We stick with texts, and we can ignore the archaeologists quite safely until they eventually get in the media, and then we have to acknowledge they were right all along. But that's a separate story about interdisciplinary things. But the further back you go, the less evidence. So the more work you have to put in to extract the blood out of the stone. If somebody produced an essay at first year undergraduate level with the amount of evidence that we have to talk about Jesus, about, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln, go back to him again, the essay would fail because you'd be told to go away and find more sources, more information.
Yes.
Than that. So ancient history is about getting blood out of a stone. And it's for the historian, this is what makes it such a thrilling enterprise, that you can take so little, as it were. I mean, again, can I stress that in terms of Jesus, we have a lot compared to many other historical figures about the similar time, but you can get so much blood out of that stone by using your brain. We don't need mass spectrometers or whatever it is you measure fish with. I don't know what you measure fish with.
Yeah, well, okay, but you know, I'm conceding that yes, there is a reasonable argument to be made for a single last common ancestor of Christian tradition. But at the same time, I gotta say that evidence is pretty weak. That,
well, again,
and I will also emphasize that, you know, as a historian and as a scientist, we all sort of emphasize the importance of textual information, of actual physical data to support our conclusions. And there isn't anything contemporary with Jesus. So
I'm sorry, the Gospels are, in ancient terms, the Gospels are so contemporary. I know that those few decades seem a lot to you, but in ancient historical terms, we don't have hardly anything to compare with that.
Well, yeah, but that's the thing is, you know, this is an unfair comparison, but comparing Jesus to Julius Caesar, for instance, we have a lot more information about Julius Caesar. And I know you will tell me, yeah, he was a major historical figure at the time. He's thoroughly well documented, all this sort of stuff. And Jesus was just some obscure guy in some distant corner of the empire.
Who happened to get a following by chance, yeah.
Yeah, but that means that the quality and the quantity of the evidence we have for a historical Jesus is got to be admitted to be very, very poor.
Okay, hey, can I throw this question around?
Yes.
As a scientist, would you like to see defunding of academic communities who look into ancient things with limited evidence, so that the money is only poured into, say, the 19th century, where there is bucket loads of government files to be looked at?
Definitely not. No, I'm at a liberal arts university, and I fully believe that we've got to support the breadth of academic research.
So you work with the evidence you have,
yes,
and you tell, but just that process of exploration. Now, if I want to I want to take it back to the academy, to the educational system for a bit. Teaching students to work, to extract, to work with, when you've only got limited data, what can you make of this? What can you do with this? Is an incredibly powerful way of teaching them what counts as evidence, what counts as a convincing argument. It's too easy to pick up a book on Albert Einstein and find out his birth and death date, and what height he was and what he did that made him so famous, and where he was as he was followed by, and when did he meet Marilyn Monroe. Tedious. Teaches you nothing about history. Push the student back a bit. Make them work really, really hard to get that blood out of the stone. Show them what constitutes evidence, what constitutes a convincing argument. So if your student comes back to you and says, Jesus died on Friday and rose on the third day, you go, why? It says so here. That's not how we work in the academy. That's how you can work in your church, but it's not how we work in the academy. You're going to have to go back and think about this again and tell me in historical terms what makes you so convinced that Jesus died on a Friday and rose on a Sunday. And you can make that argument. William Lane Craig one, I don't buy, but it is something, at least to his credit. I don't like crediting much. I think for a brilliant guy, he's very Weasley. I don't understand why. He's so brilliant. He's evidently so brilliant. Never understood why.
Because here's the deal. I agree with you that, the study of history shouldn't be recitation of dates and battles and things like that. It's all about learning how to critically evaluate the evidence. And I don't think that William Lane Craig does that very well. And in particular, that William Lane Craig's interpretation of the evidence is overwhelmed by his religious predisposition.
I think it is. But I go back to the fact, I still think he's probably brilliant. I just don't know where. I don't know the man, so I've never met him. I've seen him on YouTube. I don't think that's the fairest assessment of a person.
No, I didn't.
When you work with the academy, when you work there, you do this. And I have to say, for all the skepticism that you can apply, and you can do all the skepticism, because you will find that in 20 years' time, a slightly different Jesus. Remember, this is the historic Jesus. not the flesh and blood Jesus, but a slightly different Jesus will emerge. For historians, we find that thrilling. You as a scientist obviously find this concerning, that in one department they don't mind changing their mind every 20 years.
No. I don't find that disconcerting at all. I mean, that's kind of what I expect in biology as well. That it's not just here's my conclusion and this is truth. It's here's what I think is the answer and here's my evidence to back it up. And so, that means that there's a lot of room for interpretation, that there's a lot of room for change as new evidence emerges. And so I see history as working the same way. But what I feel like I see is a huge amount of bias towards the position that Jesus was a historical figure.
And the reason is because it's the best explanation.
But let me just concede that. Let me just pretend that I agree with you totally, that is the best explanation. I'm not sure I entirely agree, but let's say I concede that. The thing is that to present that as a fact that Jesus was a historical figure bothers me.
No facts. Remember, this is again, it's all tentative, it's all preliminary, it's all about the evidence and explanatory hypotheses to explain it, which we then tell in the form of stories, because we're historians, so we tell stories about our evidence, sort of.
And in biology, it's the same way, that there are some things we're really confident of because we got lots of evidence for, and there are a lot of things that we're very tentative about. And it seems to me that the idea of a historical Jesus is something that historians, you can say, I lean in this direction, but it's an extremely tentative position to take.
This is because when you read historical texts, and you read presumably historical texts, if they're very convincing, they're psychologically effective. We know intellectually that they are still within the realms, of the tentative hypothesis to explain the evidence, subject liable to be revised in case of a better hypothesis for the same evidence or new evidence arises. But when you read a compelling account about, how, I don't know, I really can't think of a figure off the top of my head, or how Marilyn Monroe died. There you go. And it's recentish history, but you find it pathetic and effective to you. Well, you do come to believe that what you just read is true because it emotionally affected you. Now, intellectually that it's still history. It's an explanation of the narrative facts, but it's an engagement with the human that is very, very different, perhaps, to your fish going through your mass spectrometer.
Okay, you have a weird idea of how we study fish, but okay, yeah, but this is conflating the story with the historical evidence. I mean,
no. The story is the explanation for the evidence. Again, to go back, the evidence is, in this case, the main evidence for Jesus is the Gospels and the letters of Paul. That is our main body of evidence for Jesus, along with some other incidental stuffs here and there. And there's no point in going to, people argue on the internet all the time about whether this bit of Josephus was a later oh, for God's sake, it doesn't matter. We've got 4 bloody Gospels. Let's start with those. Let's not get into whether this bit of Josephus was a later interpolation or not. These are the evidence. It's the narrative that best accounts for that evidence, that is the story that creates the historic Jesus, that then, if I persuade you by writing that well enough, you should come to believe is close to the real Jesus.
Well, but again, this is the distinction I'm making, that history is more than just the story. History is also the body of evidence that you gather together to make the story.
Absolutely. The story explains the evidence. That's all it is.
Right.
The story explains the evidence.
But you can't conflate the story with the evidence. That you have to sort those out. And no. for instance, you would not be arguing that Kevin Costner was a particularly effective Robin Hood, right? Because what you
for a long time.
I haven't either. But the whole idea is here's that Kevin Costner put together a movie that he could say explains the facts.
Okay, no, I'd go further. I would say the Kevin Costner movie is evidence about the real Robin Hood. It's not evidence that I would find very useful. I'm not going to be able to do anything with it. But since it is an account and it's drawing on its own sources, in order, and probably multiple sources to create, it becomes evidence about Robin Hood itself. Now, it's not useful evidence because I'd leave it to film critics to talk about that. But it is because it itself must have drawn on certain streams of Robin Hood folklore, possibly synthesizing them, possibly splitting them, possibly sorting. It itself is a piece of evidence about Robin Hood. And now I say I wouldn't use it. Film critics.
Yeah, but here's another factor that gets thrown in here, is that Kevin Costner built a movie around a collection of myths, and yeah, you could say, okay, this is evidence that these myths existed, and then he's drawing on this pool of storytelling. But I would also say that humans kind of like the idea of somebody fighting for the underprivileged. That this is a vastly appealing idea. And I would say the same thing about Jesus, that there's something really appealing about a person who sacrifices himself to to somehow save the world.
Really? My own personal Jesus, to quote Depeche Mode, sort of is so stuck in his moment. He's concerned with a certain relationship of the temple to a Roman Empire. He believes that temple is corrupt because it's complicit. This does not really speak to my personal position right here in Perth in Western Australia. I'm not that obsessed with whether or not the temple is complicit with the Roman Empire right now. It's not a particular. This is my historical narrative. So yes, you're talking about what the myth is compelling. I'm talking about this. This is not a very compelling historical narrative, but I find it to be a true one, a convincing one, and because it's convincing, true. Let's not miss the step out there.
Okay. I think we're sort of talking past each other right now, because this is, that when I was growing up and going to church, what was compelling about the Jesus myth were the emotional attachments that it made to it. I mean, if you watch any of those old Robe and Jesus epics from the 1950s and 1960s, you can tell that what they really hammer on is how good and kind and wonderful Jesus was,
and how we should be like that too.
Correct. And so there's this psychological story that we are drawing on that contributes to the Jesus myth. Absolutely. And I don't think we can discount that, but it's not evidence for the historicity of Jesus. It's evidence for what we wish was true.
I don't wish that Jesus either did exist or
didn't. I don't either. Because
at the end of the day, it's a rather obscure thing. I say it's almost certainly related to my biographical background. Almost certainly. In fact, I don't know why I'm saying almost certainly. It is certainly related to my biographical background. What am I trying to do? Am I trying to disprove my dad? Am I trying to support? God knows. I'll wait for the psychotherapist to figure out, what my motivations particularly are. But I find it interesting. I find it, and I find the story, that the current version of the historical Jesus, which isn't that far from Reza Aslan's one of a radical zealot, trying to basically organize troops to overthrow the temple. Mine's not that far. I just don't think he succeeded. Well, he didn't succeed. Yeah. Reza Aslan doesn't believe he succeeded, but I mean, he believed he got further in his plans as a sort of a radical than I do. But this is what makes history so exciting. And one more thing, I have to actually go in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
So, I've learned a lot about how not to treat fish with mass spectrometers.
Yeah, you'd have to grind them up and everything. You just lose a lot of information.
And a lot of flavor, presumably too.
Yeah, well, dissolving them in organic solvents would do that. Yeah.
Just one thing, I did touch on this in our email correspondence. There's another way to do history, and this will just move away from Jesus for 2 seconds. The same evidence can be looked at in the light of new concerns. So in the 60s, feminist history looked back over exactly the same body of evidence that had been treated 1,000 times before by 1,000 white male historians, and found new stories, new narratives that explained this evidence better. Things that were difficult to explain under the old white male narrative suddenly made sense when a little bit of feminist thought, a little bit of feminist philosophy was introduced into casting your eye over the evidence and constructing a new narrative. Queer theory was doing that a lot in the 90s as well, and to a large extent today. So I'm currently working on a paper which is about why young boys in Perth, in Western Australia, 100 years ago, were all told that their feminist teachers were evil and not to masturbate. It's those two things. They're linked. They're not two separate things. They're linked. The answer is, when you look at it, looked through a traditional thing, you would have looked at, chains. You'd have hunted down what sort of books were these educationalists reading that made them worried about masturbation. You'd have looked for a historical route. Under queer theory, we now look at going, what made people so nervous that masculinity and heterosexuality weren't natural? Why did in this moment of crisis are you revealing the unnaturalness, at least for these people who find it in crisis, of masculinity? And that is something that queer theory. So the same body of evidence can be looked at in a new way with new tools. So it's not just the case that, you're limited gospel. There are queer readings of the gospel, by the way. I am not familiar with them. I haven't read them. I know they exist out there, though. I would be fascinated. One day I should chase them up to find out, what new stories are being constructed by going over the gospel to the queer eye.
Yeah, and I also see that we do a lot of reinterpreting of the evidence based on new perspectives, and that's a good thing. I guess what I would say, though, is that deeply colored by a cultural presupposition that he was a real character who really existed. And that maybe what we should be saying now is it would be useful for historians to take a much more skeptical approach to the historicity of Jesus. That would be an avenue to take, to look at the evidence with new eyes and reinterpret it and do some serious research on exactly how reliable is this story.
Here's the deal. You actually made a historical claim there. You claimed that historians operate in this way because of a particular cultural background that will have historical, precedents to generate that cultural background. That's one hell of a historical claim about the way historians. You write the paper proving that all historians are fixed on this, and I'll get the historians to rewrite the historical Jesus on your behalf. Is that a fair deal?
I think I propose the null hypothesis. That I think we can assume that in a society that was steeped in Christianity, there is a great deal of bias towards considering him.
Of course.
So it's not like I'm not picking out some individual historian and saying, oh, you were wrong because you were bigoted in favor of Christianity. I'm saying then we could expect that that there's a general background of bias, and I don't consider that a surprising or radical assumption. Do you?
I don't think it is. I was just pointing out that it is actually a historical claim you're making, though.
Oh yes,
and you're making it using sort of without the evidence that I require to be convinced that.
Well,
sorry, then I'm not really attacking you.
Yeah, I know. I don't feel like I'm being attacked. But I would just counter with, then the same with the historical Jesus, that I'm not seeing the evidence that I would expect to see in support of that hypothesis.
I think I really do think it's almost a case of different temperaments. I know from your writings you really enjoy sci-fi movies, for example, and books. I can't stand sci-fi or movies. I get nothing.
Let's end this right now.
The last sci-fi movie I watched from start to finish was probably what I'm still going to call Episode 3 of Star Wars. That is, I'm going to insist on calling it 3. I know that the young people like to call it 6.
Right.
That is probably the last sci-fi movie I ever watched, give or take. I'm probably something in between. So it's a difference. You get something out of reading the texts the sci-fi texts your way. You get something out of watching these movies. I get annoyed. That is my. But I love reading somebody trying to take 3 lines of an ancient Akkadian poem published in 1600 BC and trying to reconstruct an entire society based on those lines. That makes me happy.
Yes, but I would also say, I can watch Star Wars and be fully conscious of the fact that it's total story. It's not real. There's no evidence. There's no fact behind it. And if I read your Akkadian poetry, I would be saying, this is really interesting, but this is a limited sample to draw such sweeping conclusions from. But, which is rigorously interesting. Could be fun.
There's going to be a thing somewhere where some historian is going to have a sign above, the bigger the historian, the smaller the evidence. It's just going to say that above their desk somewhere. I know somebody will have that. In fact, now I'm going to make them and sell them to historians.
That's a really common saying that in the academy, that the intensity of the debate is inversely proportional to the size of the problem.
Oh, yes. And you should see how bitter the debates get in historical conferences.
Oh, yeah, we should swap conferences sometime. You could see the similarities in both.
Well, it has been delightful talking to you. I am, as I say, in a mate's house, so I feel vaguely obliged at 9:30 at night to go and thank them for their wine and then drink some more of their wine. So,
yeah, I cannot start on the wine yet. I'll have more coffee.
I mean, I know we haven't. It was never going to be a case of reaching a consensus between us, and you and I just bashing out the truth and then finding out so we can just broadcast to the world, here's the truth about Jesus. But what I hope is that, well, not necessarily for you, but at least somebody listening now gets an idea that historians aren't just, reading the Gospels. And more importantly, I'd love to just get across to atheists how important the Gospels are as 2,000-year-old ancient texts that have been culturally conservative in their changes. I mean, any good copy of a study Bible will say at the bottom, footnote A, some variant manuscripts say. Most of these are irrelevant. They're just tiny. This is an amazing body of evidence that can be worked with by historians. You might not like the conclusions, you might want them to come to different, more conservative things, but it is a body of evidence that can be worked. And I think sometimes atheists just too dismissive. The fairy tales in the Bible, I don't see any value in that.
Well, I agree with you. I think it is evidence that the Bible actually is a cultural artifact that reflects the ideas of the people of the time. It's just how we interpret it that may differ.
It does. It clearly does. And I say, I'm obviously going to go away thinking I'm right. And I'm going to go away and I'm going to go away and study how to study fish.
Yeah. You may find it as dry and boring as telling me I have to go learn Greek to properly understand Christian history. But
thank you very much indeed for an engaging conversation.
It's been fun.
I found it delightful.
Good.
Live long and prosper, as I believe they say in your
right. Okay.
Thanks very much indeed, PC.
Talk to you later.
Cheers.
Bye.